So I think I mentioned earlier that we were going to back the truck up a little bit because there are a lot of new people to Region 6, or west side of Oregon and Washington and Northern California, who haven't grown up with the spotted owl. So I asked Betsy Glenn to come talk to you. She's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she's going to give you kind of an overview of the population dynamics of the spotted owl, why it was listed, what's the current status, and what the recovery strategy is. So let's kind of back up and start from some of the beginning stuff. So help me welcome Betsy while I get her started.
Thanks, Cheryl. As Cheryl said, my presentation is going to focus on the biology of the spotted owl. In particular, I'm going to talk about the population status and trends for this species, including what led to its initial listing and what has happened since that time. I'll also provide some background on the threats to the species and how these have changed over time, and how these affect the management strategy for the species. So most of you probably know this, but some of you don't, so I'm going to start with very basic biology background of the species. Spotted owl was listed as a threatened species in 1990. It's a medium-sized, dark brown owl that's one of 3 subspecies of spotted owls that's found in North America. It's a year-round resident of the Pacific Northwest forests and is most commonly found in late successional and old-growth forest. Spotted owls are territorial, and they maintain very large home ranges on the order of 1,500 hectares, or about 3,000 acres. They nest in the spring, about this time of year, often displaying an alternate pattern in nesting every other year. So looking at annual survival of adult owls has generally been quite high. The graph up here shows annual survival on the y-axis with 1 being 100% chance of surviving from one year to the next. So spotted owls, if you were an adult, typically had about an 85% chance of surviving from one year to the next. Reproduction is much more variable. You can see that alternate year pattern on the bottom graph. And this type of species is sort of using this long-lived strategy to promote their population growth and trends. So high annual survival, and then you have new individuals being recruited sort of intermittently over the lifespan of individual owls. So the threats to the spotted owl have typically been identified as primarily habitat loss, and then more recently by the increase in population of barred owls in the Pacific Northwest. And this newly established barred owl population has had a dramatic effect on spotted owls. And since the time of listing, declines in spotted owl populations have been reported across the range of the species. And over this presentation, I'm going to spend much more time sort of describing these population trends and what factors may be influencing them. Oops. So since the spotted owl was listed in 1990, there's been a kind of long and convoluted process of recovery planning and critical habitat rulemaking for this species. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown of this process and what's happened over the past 20 years. So after the initial listing of the spotted owl, a draft recovery plan and critical habitat rule were developed in 1992, but these were never finalized. And after the owl was listed, there was a series of court cases that essentially shut down timber harvest on all federal lands. So in 1993, President Clinton held a conference in Portland to address this issue and established the FEMAT, or Forest Ecosystem Management and Assessment Team. And this team was charged with developing a comprehensive and long-term management plan for about 24 million acres of federal forest lands within the range of the spotted owl. And so this resulted in the development of the Northwest Forest Plan, which was implemented in 1994. And as Paul mentioned before, the Northwest Forest Plan has served as a really important landscape level plan that's contributed to the conservation of the spotted owl. However, there was still no final recovery plan or final critical habitat rule for the species. So in 2008, a final recovery plan and critical habitat rule were developed, but in 2009, this plan and recovery plan and critical habitat rule were remanded by court order. So in 2011, a final recovery plan was implemented, and in 2012, which is the focus of this workshop today, a final revised recovery plan was developed. And at the same time, the service also issued a final environmental impact statement for barred owl removal. And as I'll discuss in more detail, this has important consequences for strategies for recovering the northern spotted owl. So, getting back to what caused the spotted owl to be listed in the first place. At the time of listing, the service identified widespread habitat loss across the species range and inadequate regulatory mechanisms to conserve the spotted owl as the two primary threats. At that time, the service also looked at a number of other more detailed factors that were evaluated within each physiographic province where the spotted owl occurs. And these included things such as low population sizes and declining populations, limited and declining habitat, inadequate distribution and isolation of populations, and also some other factors such as vulnerability to natural disturbances, and pressures from predation and competition, which included the barred owls. And these last two, we didn't know that much about how these may be affecting spotted owls. They might be a problem, but nobody really had a good sense for what the impacts truly may be. So in 2011, when the final revised recovery plan was developed, these key threats were reassessed at that time. And although habitat loss was still a significant threat, it was determined that competition with barred owls had become an equally important problem. In addition, past habitat loss and current habitat loss were identified as important threats. Other factors identified included threats from disease, such as West Nile virus, and changes in environmental conditions and ecosystem structure and function resulting from climate change. So since the time of listing, habitat loss has remained as a key threat, but barred owls have gone from something that might be a problem to something that really looks like a major problem for the species. And one of the most critical tools for identifying these threats and also being able to determine how these threats are affecting spotted owls has been through population monitoring. So since the early 1990s, long-term trends in spotted owl population status have been monitored primarily under the Effectiveness Monitoring Program for northern spotted owls under the Northwest Forest Plan. And one of the objectives of this program has been to assess whether implementing the Northwest Forest Plan will reverse the downward trends in spotted owl populations. And this monitoring program that was developed to answer this question has formed the foundation for the population monitoring strategy for spotted owls. And it also has become one of the most comprehensive avian databases in the world for tracking avian population trends. Oops. So within this program, there's 8 long-term spotted owl demographic study areas that were developed as part of the Effectiveness Monitoring Program, as well as a number of other study areas that used very similar methods of data collection. And these have been used as the primary source for tracking spotted owl demographic rates and population trends over time. And approximately every 5 years, data from all of these study areas are analyzed under a common framework to determine annual survival, reproduction, rate of population change, both for the individual study areas and also in a meta-analysis combining the data across all of the areas. These analyses have been conducted in 1991, 1993, 1998, 2004, 2009, and most recently this past January in this building in 2014. And the 2 most recent analyses have included data from a total of 11 study areas. These include the 8 study areas in the Effectiveness Monitoring Program and 3 additional areas with long-term data sets. And as you can see from the map, these areas are distributed across the range of the northern spotted owl, and they represent most of the physiographic provinces in which the owl is found. And by using individually marked owls and tracking occupancy and vital rates in these territories over time, these studies have been able to estimate annual survival rates, reproductive rates, and annual rate of population change across all of these study areas. So what do these trends look like? Oops. There we go. And so the results from the most recent 2014 analysis are not yet available. And I know everybody really wants to know what they are, but I don't have them. So we are going to review the results from the 2009 analysis, which was published in the Forsman et al. 2011 publication. And so this table provides a summary of the results for the trends in the demographic rates for the 11 study areas. And study areas are listed, I don't have a pointer, on the first column, going from north to south with Cle Elum and Rainier in the north, going down to Hoopa and Green Diamond in Northern California in the south. So as I mentioned before, spotted owl reproduction tends to vary considerably from year to year. However, the average fecundity, or number of female young produced per female owl, was declining at 4 of these areas, shown in red. It was relatively stable at another 4, and was actually increasing slightly at 3 for this 2009 analysis. Annual survival, on the other hand, was declining at 10 of the 11 areas. And this result was of a particular concern because for this long-lived species, annual survival is the main factor that influences population trends. And so rate of population change, which essentially combines annual survival and the recruitment of new individuals into the population, was declining at 7 of the 11 areas. And as you can see in this, lambda RJS, any number that's below 1 indicates a declining population. So there were 4 areas in the more southern portion of the range where those estimates, even though they're below 1, were not significantly different from 1. So those were the only 4 that appeared to potentially be stable at that time, and this was 5 years ago. So for those of you who like a more visual representation of these trends, the next few graphs show that realized rate of population change over time. So in these graphs, 1 represents the initial population at time 0, which is 1990 for most of these study areas, and then the subsequent years show the amount of decline over time. So this first, again, we're going to move from north to south. So looking at Cle Elum first, this area had the largest decrease over time, with the population size in 2006 showing a 60% decline from the initial population size in 1990. In Oregon, this is the Oregon Coast Range study area, showed about a 40% decline, with much of that decline occurring in the last 4 years between 2004 and 2009. California showed a lesser decline, but still about a 25% decline from the initial population level. So both of these analyses in 2011 and then this most recent one in 2014 also examined factors that may be influencing these trends. In 2011, the amount of high-quality spotted owl habitat, which was described as late successional forest around spotted owl sites, was found to have a positive effect on fecundity. That's the number of young produced. So you have more old forest, higher numbers of young produced. And also a positive effect on the recruitment of new individuals into the population in that rate of population change analysis. So again, the more old forest there was, the more individuals were born into the population and were also recruited into the population as adults. These analyses also looked at the influence of barred owls on these demographic rates. So this graph shows the percentage of spotted owl territories where barred owls were detected for the Oregon study areas over time. And as you can tell, around 1990, there really weren't that many barred owls in these areas. But by the late 1990s and then in the 2000s, barred owl encounter rates for these areas increased dramatically. And this 2009 analysis found that as the barred owl presence increased, there was a negative effect on fecundity, that's the number of young produced per female, on 4 of the study areas. They also found a negative effect of barred owls on survival at 5 of the study areas, and a negative effect on the recruitment of new individuals into the population on that rate of population growth analysis. So in addition to habitat and barred owls, these studies have also included other factors such as influence of climate on spotted owl population trends. And this 2009 study found that the effects of, there was a negative effect of cold, wet springs on fecundity of spotted owls. And that's something that's been documented across the range of the spotted owl for, at least 20 years. So, getting back to barred owls. Both of the most recent analysis have shown that these barred owls have had a negative impact on spotted owl population trends. So we're going to spend a little time explaining what we know about barred owls at this time and how that affects, strategies for recovery for spotted owls. And barred owls are closely related to spotted owls. Both species are members of the genus Strix. Barred owls are slightly larger than spotted owls and tend to be considerably more aggressive. Similar to spotted owls, they tend to nest in mature forests. However, their home ranges are about less than half the size of spotted owl ranges, sometimes as little as a quarter of the size of a spotted owl range. So at least historically, barred owls were native to the forests of eastern North America. They live year-round in mixed forests of large trees, often near water. Similar to spotted owls, they tend to occur in large, unfragmented blocks of mature forests, likely because these woodlands support high diversity of prey and are likely to have large cavities suitable for nesting. Their preferred habitats range from swamps to stream sides to uplands and may contain hemlock, maple, oak, hickory, beech, white spruce, aspen, balsam poplar, and more recently, Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, and western larch. So in the second half of the 20th century, there were occasional reports of barred owls west of the Great Plains. By 1990, however, sightings within the range of the spotted owl had increased to the level where this species was identified as a potential threat to spotted owls. At that time, no one was really sure what that threat level was, but the two species appeared to be occupying very similar habitats, and the barred owl was noted to be larger and more aggressive at that time. So by the late 1990s and early 2000s, barred owls were widespread across the range of northern spotted owl, often displacing spotted owls from their territories, and over the subsequent decade have become widespread across the entire range of the spotted owl, moving well down into California. So at the time of listing, barred owls were identified as a potential threat, but nobody really knew that much about them. By the early 2000s, we knew that barred owls had increased fairly dramatically in the Pacific Northwest and were recognized as an increasing threat. And by 2004, when the service did a 5-year review for the species, at that time, the level of concern about barred owls was about equal to that of habitat concerns. And then in the most recent recovery plan, the barred owls have been identified as one of the 3 primary threats to spotted owl recovery. And there's, oops, let's see, here we go. Haven't quite mastered this PowerPoint setup, sorry about that. So there's been intensive research on barred owls and spotted owl interaction since about the late 1990s, early 2000s, and that has been instrumental in helping us understand how these two species interact on, come on, there we go, in the Pacific Northwest forest. So what I'll do now is a quick rundown of a few of the key studies and what we've learned from them. And I'm going to skip over the meta-analysis since we have discussed those in a little bit of detail. So one of the earlier publications was a study by Liz Kelly, who reported that site occupancy by spotted owls declined after barred owls were detected in an area. And Liz looked at this across the range of the spotted owl, and this was one of the studies that first clearly documented impacts of barred owls on spotted owl site occupancy. This is a study by Hamer in 2007 that used data collected from barred owls and spotted owls that were radioed in the Mount Baker area. And these birds were actually radioed in the late 1980s, but the analysis wasn't done until quite a number of years later. And this study found that both spotted owl and barred owl home range sizes were correlated with old forest. So basically, if you had more old forest, home range sizes were smaller for both species because the owls could get their resources in a smaller area. The study reported that barred owls tended to avoid areas of younger forest within their range, or spotted owls tended to avoid the younger areas within their home range, but barred owls used them in proportion to availability. In 2011, Katie Duggar here at OSU completed a publication and reported that barred owls had a negative effect on spotted owl site colonization. So this is if you have an area where there's a site that's not currently occupied by owls. If barred owls are in the area, spotted owls are much less likely to be able to establish themselves on those sites. She also found that if the barred owls were present in an area, it was much more likely for those sites occupied for spotted owls to become vacant or go extinct. She also found that in areas with less old forest, that rate of site extinction for spotted owls was higher. And finally, she found that in areas of less fragmentation, so areas where you had larger blocks of old forest, you had higher colonization rates by spotted owls. So spotted owls were more likely to be able to come back into an area and occupy a site. So another study was done by Dave Wiens. This was his PhD work in the Oregon Coast Range. And Dave found that spotted owls tended to select steep areas dominated by old conifers, while barred owls used forest types more evenly and used flatter slopes, so down lower, often closer to streams. Another thing that Dave reported was that barred owls had 6 times as many young during his study area as spotted owls. They tended to nest every year much more often than spotted owls and would often have much larger clutch sizes than spotted owls, who tend to have 1 to 3 nestlings when they do nest. He reported that both northern flying squirrels and wood rats were important prey for both species, but barred owls used many additional aquatic, terrestrial, and diurnal species. He also found, similar to the other studies, that this annual survival of both species was positively related to the amount of old conifer forest within their home range. So about the same time, Peter Singleton was also working on his PhD, but this was up in the eastern Washington Cascades. And he found that, similar to Dave, barred owls were more often found on gentle slopes at lower elevations. Barred owls used a broader range of forest structure, so again, barred owls seem to be using a much wider range of habitat within their home ranges. Spotted owl occupancy declined less at sites with good habitat. That's very similar to what Katie Duggar found in her studies. Oops, got ahead of myself there. And, there we go. So to summarize, both barred owls and spotted owls like old forest habitat, but barred owls seem to be much less picky about what habitat types they use within their home range. Barred owl home ranges are much smaller than spotted owl ranges, meaning there can be about 3 to 5 times as many barred owl territories within the space occupied by one spotted owl territory. Barred owls also have a much higher reproductive output. Both wood rats and flying squirrels seem to be important for both species, but barred owls will eat just about anything that moves. So they are very general and will pretty much eat anything they can find. Barred owls appear to have been more successful at taking over spotted owl territories in areas with less old forest or in areas with higher fragmentation. And while there does appear to be some niche separation in both habitat selection and diet between these two species, barred owls appear to be steadily increasing across the range of the northern spotted owl, while spotted owl occupancy appears to be declining. And this graph is fairly typical of every study area that has had long-term monitoring of spotted owl territories over time. So on the y-axis we have percent of territories occupied by spotted owls. The red line is barred owl occupancy of those territories. The blue line is spotted owl occupancy. So as you can see, there's been continued declines, and at this point we have not yet seen a point where barred owls have either leveled off in their occupancy or spotted owl declines have become less. So thus we are faced with a dilemma when it comes to implementing recovery strategies for the spotted owl. So the recovery objectives for the spotted owl is basically so that we can achieve recovery so that the species can be removed from listing under the Endangered Species Act. And despite the changes in threats that have occurred over time, the recovery objectives for the spotted owl have pretty much remained the same over time. Have populations that are efficiently large and well distributed, that species no longer requires listing, ensure that adequate habitat is available and will continue to exist, and that the threats have been eliminated or reduced such that populations are stable or increasing. And so where does that leave us for recovering the spotted owl? Basically, the threats are habitat and barred owls. We cannot look at one without the other. Both need to be addressed. So for habitat, we have the Northwest Forest Plan, which for the past 25 years has provided habitat protections for the spotted owl. We have the 2011 Recovery Plan, which we have a number of recovery actions, which we will probably touch on today, that deal specifically with protecting spotted owl habitat. And we have the 2012 Critical Habitat Rule, which is the purpose of this workshop here today. For barred owls, there are 10 recovery actions within the 2011 Recovery Plan that specifically address barred owls, and probably most importantly, we're looking at a removal experiment to evaluate how effective removing barred owls is for recovering spotted owl populations. So, and with that, I've probably run right up against my last minute. Because we have 2 minutes, I'll take any questions that anybody has. Larry.
So, based on the lack of recruitment by spotted owls, have there been any analysis or studies looking at the distribution within the adult cohort of age classes? And are spotted owls basically becoming, from the adult perspective, a bunch of geriatrics? Versus, you know, the barred owls and their reproductive success, it would seem like the age class structure within the adult cohort is much younger for barred owls, older for spotted owls, and is there any concern about are we reaching a period when there could be a major decline in the adult population of spotted just due to old age?
Yeah, so the question was, has anybody looked at the age structure of spotted owl populations kind of in relation to barred owls, just given that, you know, spotted owls appear to be able to survive on these territories, but they haven't been reproducing. And there haven't been any studies that I know of specifically at that, but I would say just on anecdotal evidence, I would say, yes, that is true. The spotted owls that are persisting on these landscapes, a lot of them have been there for a long time and haven't reproduced in a number of years. There's been, I know, one study looking at lifetime reproduction of spotted owls, but that did not specifically look at age structure of existing populations. Question in the back?
Can you address why the often heard, well, this is just the natural way of things, and species just come in and other species go out, and that's just kind of how it goes, and it's just natural that barred owls are coming in. We hear that a lot. I was wondering if you could touch on some of the arguments for, well, maybe it's not really that natural, and the whys for why barred owls.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question was in relation to barred owl invasion into the Pacific Northwest and whether this is a natural invasion or not. Yeah, and that's a question that still exists within, you know, the owl research community, although, I mean, barred owls typically were on the, you know, native to the east coast of the United States, and there's a lot of strong feeling that, you know, just conditions in the Great Plains have changed over the past 100 years quite a bit. There's been establishment of farms, and, you know, farms, you build trees and, you know, windbreaks, trees that provide avenues for, you know, birds that need something to roost on to travel across those large areas. It's true, we don't really know what the actual mechanism is for barred owls getting across, but there's sufficient evidence to indicate that people have done enough stuff on the landscape and modified it to an extent that it's likely that we had a strong impact on factors that drove barred owls to move west.
You just provided a lot of useful information showing that spotted owls do better where there's more older forest habitat, and barred owls do better in more fragmented habitats. And given that fact,
The question was that since barred owls seem to do pretty well with a more diverse mix of habitats within their home ranges, spotted owls like late successional forest more, wouldn't conducting clear cuts favor barred owls? I think in a lot of cases that is true. I think if there's more fragmentation and there's a lot of barred owls in the area, that has the potential to favor the barred owl. On the other hand, both species have been shown, the annual survival of both species has been closely linked to amount of old forest. So you could also potentially have declines in barred owl population performance with less old forest habitat available. And I think we have run out of time. Thank you.
So Spotted Owl 101 there in half hour or less. Thank you, Betsy.